You thought you could buy land and disappear. In 2019, rural Ontario, you found 10 quiet acres. No neighbors, no grid, no noise, just trees, sunlight, and the fantasy that land ownership still meant freedom. Then the township inspector showed up with a stop work order, citing Ontario Building Code Division B, Section 9.36. The energy efficiency requirement you were never told would apply to a 300-square-foot cabin with a wood stove and solar panels. They called it Minimum Life Safety Standards. Translation, connect to the grid or don't live there. Your dream of independence died under fluorescent office lights, a stack of permit fees, and a threat to condemn your own land. And this isn't one bad township, this is a pattern. Tonight, we're breaking down 5 Canadian provinces that quietly turned off-grid living into a regulatory maze designed to make damn sure you stay plugged in, legally, financially, and permanently. You thought land meant autonomy. You watched the YouTube videos, bearded guys with solar panels and wood stoves living free on crown land myths and homesteader nostalgia. You saved for years. You found your piece of northern Ontario in 2015, 10 acres with no services, and you thought that meant no rules. The real estate agent smiled. The lawyer processed the deed. Nobody mentioned zoning maps or building permits. Nobody said those were anything but optional formalities for people who wanted city inspectors poking around. You weren't anti-society. You just wanted to be left alone. So you bought the land, cash, and started planning your cabin. A young couple did the same thing that year, 40 kilometers north of you. They believed no services equals no rules. You're nodding right now because you believed it too. That's intentional. They sold you a fantasy, and you bought it with both hands. By 2016, something shifted. Provincial governments across Canada started reframing building codes as climate leadership and public safety. The language changed overnight. Suddenly, every policy document mentioned resilience and minimum performance standards. No premier stood at a podium and announced an off-grid ban. That would have been political suicide. Instead, they buried it in standards. Ontario aligned its energy efficiency updates with the National Building Code 2015 adoption, and the regulations started creeping into rural townships that had never enforced anything. The official line was about protecting homeowners from unsafe construction. The reality? They don't ban off-grid living. They just make it uninsurable, unoccupiable, and illegal to sleep in. Every Sheng played the same game with different words. Green parties called it environmental responsibility. Conservative governments called it consumer protection. Either way, you couldn't build your cabin without their permission, their inspectors, and their fees. And Ontario was just warming up. The first denial came in 2018, Nova Scotia. A couple bought 12 acres near Antigonish, planning a small off-grid homestead with a composting toilet and rainwater collection. They filed for a building permit, playing by the rules, doing everything right. The township denied it. Reason: lack of approved wastewater design. The composting toilet they'd researched for months, not acceptable without an engineered septic plan. Cost $1,800 for engineering drawings, nearest certified inspector willing to sign off on alternative systems 92 kilometers away. Approval timeline 5 to 7 months, assuming no complications. They'd budgeted $12,000 for the land and another $8,000 for construction. The compliance costs alone hit $9,000 before they could break ground, and the 6-month delay meant missing the building season entirely. They sold the land at a loss 8 months later. The township kept the permit application fee. Now let's name the provinces doing this on purpose. Ontario became the bureaucratic juggernaut between 2019 and 2022. The province amended Section 9.36 of the Ontario Building Code, adding mandatory energy efficiency modeling for all new residential construction. Didn't matter if you were building a 200-square-foot cabin or a 4,000-square-foot mansion. You needed grid-equivalent energy performance calculations. Solar-only systems got rejected without a professional engineer's sign-off, and good luck finding a PEng willing to certify an off-grid setup in rural Ontario. A woman in Muskoka spent $8,000 on energy modeling and compliance inspections for her tiny cabin. She had functioning solar panels and a wood stove. The township condemned it anyway for lack of permanent grid connection. The inspector's report cited inadequate long-term energy security. Translation: your solar panels might fail someday, so we're protecting you from yourself by making sure you can't live there. The math was impossible. $8,000 in modeling, $3,500 in inspection fees, all for a structure smaller than most people's garages. Energy efficiency meant utility compliance, nothing more. British Columbia doesn't bury you in paperwork, they price you out. British Columbia introduced the BC Energy Step Code between 2017 and 2021, and rural townships adopted it with enthusiasm that would make a climate conference proud. Steps 3 through 5 required net zero energy pathways, which sounds progressive until you realize what it meant in practice. Certified energy advisors, professional mechanical system design, and blower door testing in locations where the nearest qualified contractor was 3 hours away. Rural exemptions that had existed for decades quietly disappeared from municipal bylaws. An off-grid builder in the Kootenays, experienced with solar and backup systems, applied for a building permit in 2020. Denied. Reason: no demonstrated grid tie capability. He explained he didn't want grid connection, that was the entire point. The township explained that the code required proof of code-equivalent energy performance, and without utility connection, there was no baseline to measure against. He'd need 3 separate energy consultants and $15,000 in modeling studies for land that didn't even have utility access. Translation: climate leadership equals engineered dependency. The province that branded itself as Canada's green frontier made damn sure you couldn't go green without paying their approved experts. Alberta pretends to be different. It isn't. Alberta sells itself as Canada's libertarian heartland, the province where government stays small and people stay free. That mythology died with the Safety Codes Act and municipal adoption of National Building Code energy standards in 2020. Counties across rural Alberta started enforcing occupancy rules with aggressive precision. A retiree outside Sundra, sitting on 40 acres with a hand-dug well that had supplied clean water for 30 years, received a municipal notice: connect to the regional water system or face non-occupancy designation. He refused. The county fined him $500, then $1,000, then threatened to red tag his property as uninhabitable. His well worked perfectly. The county didn't care. The official justification was health standards. Private wells couldn't be trusted to meet modern safety requirements. The real reason? The regional water system had been built with provincial infrastructure grants, and the county needed customers to justify the debt payments. He paid for the hookup, $40,200 for a service he didn't want, replacing a system that worked fine. Translation: health standards equal compulsory service fees. Conservative branding, identical outcome. Quebec adds a cultural filter to the same trap. Quebec's building regulations operate through the Building Act, layered with municipal zoning and one additional barrier that makes everything worse: French-only application requirements. An Anglophone family from Ontario bought land in the eastern townships in 2018, planning a modest off-grid retreat. They filed their building permit application in English. Rejected. Applications must be submitted in French. They hired a translator. $4,000 later, they resubmitted. Then the delays started, 14 months waiting for a certificate of compliance that should have taken 90 days. When they called to check status, municipal officials explained the file was under review. No details, no timeline. Appeals were theoretically possible but required navigating a French-language administrative tribunal that operated on schedules nobody could predict. They spent another $6,000 on legal consultations trying to understand why a straightforward building permit had turned into a Kafka novel. The township eventually issued conditional approval, pending septic system redesign, electrical inspection by a licensed Quebec contractor, and structural review by a provincial engineer. Total additional cost $11,000 they never built. Delays weaponized. Complexity deployed as control. Atlantic Canada finishes the job quietly. Nova Scotia's on-site sewage regulations, enforced with renewed vigor after 2019, turned environmental protection into a compliance treadmill. A cabin owner outside Lunenburg installed a composting toilet system. Modern, professionally designed, zero discharge. The system worked flawlessly for 2 years. Then came the inspection notice. New provincial regulations required re-inspection of all alternative waste systems every 18 months. Cost: $850 per inspection cycle, forever. He called the inspector, explained the system had no complaints, no failures, no issues. The inspector was polite but firm. Composting systems were classified as experimental technology under provincial guidelines and required ongoing monitoring. Translation: your DIY sustainability must be professionally supervised indefinitely at your expense. He paid the first inspection fee, then the second. By the third cycle, he'd spent more on compliance than the system cost to install. Environmental protection meant revenue generation disguised as oversight. 5 provinces, 5 different political identities, and every single one made off-grid living economically impossible through regulatory exhaustion. Different flags, same outcome. The provinces vary politically. Conservative Alberta, NDP British Columbia, Liberal Ontario, Nationalist Quebec, Atlantic pragmatism. The outcomes are identical: forced grid connection or grid equivalent standards, occupancy certificate denial for off-grid systems, cost exhaustion through inspection cycles, engineering requirements, and permit delays. The pattern becomes obvious once you see it: building codes written for suburban subdivisions applied without modification to wilderness properties. A 200-square-foot cabin faces the same energy efficiency modeling requirements as a 3,000-square-foot house. A composting toilet needs the same engineering certification as a municipal sewage connection. The regulatory framework doesn't distinguish between living off-grid by choice and building substandard housing by neglect. It treats them identically and punishes both. Every province justifies it differently. Ontario calls it safety. BC calls it climate action. Alberta calls it health protection. The method changes. The result doesn't. The certificate of occupancy became the choke point. Every province requires one before you can legally live in a structure you built on land you own. Without it, you can't get insurance. You can't get financing if you need it. You can't legally establish residency. The inspector can visit once, note a dozen code violations for systems that work perfectly fine, and you're done. No occupancy certificate means no legal right to sleep in your own cabin. The townships don't need to bulldoze your property or force you off at gunpoint. They just decline to issue a piece of paper, and suddenly you're homeless on your own land. Translation: you can build, you just can't live there. People give up not because they're weak, but because the system was designed to exhaust them. You file the permit application, it gets rejected for technical deficiency, a missing stamp, an uncertified plan, an unapproved material. You refile, months pass, you call, nobody answers, you hire a consultant. The consultant identifies 6 more requirements. You pay, you wait, the inspector visits. New problems, you fix them, you request re-inspection, more delays. Eventually you realize the process has no end. Appeals get ignored, inspectors go silent, phone calls unreturned. You surrender, not because you're defeated, but because the system has no exit. And then you ask yourself, who benefits from this? This was never about safety. If it were, the codes would distinguish between dangerous construction and functional off-grid systems. They don't. If it were about public health, composting toilets that meet international standards would be approved without $2,000 engineering reviews. They aren't. If it were about protecting consumers, rural buyers would be informed about regulatory requirements before purchasing land. They're not. The system serves different interests. Utilities need customers to justify infrastructure investments and government subsidies. Municipalities need permit fees and property tax revenue from occupied residences. Provincial bureaucracies need relevance, and building codes give them perpetual authority over private construction. No villains, just incentives aligning to make independence expensive and compliance mandatory. You thought land meant freedom. You imagined buying a piece of wilderness, building a small cabin, and living simply. No mortgage, no utility bills, no dependency on systems you don't trust. That dream is still legal to have. It's just illegal to live. The grid you can't see isn't electrical. It's economic, legal, and enforced by building codes that don't care whether your solar panels work or your well water is clean. 5 provinces, different politics, identical outcomes. Ontario buries you in energy modeling requirements. BC prices you out with professional certification mandates. Alberta forces service connections you don't want. Quebec delays you into bankruptcy. Nova Scotia inspects you into surrender. They don't chain you to the grid. They just make damn sure you can't legally exist without it. The code says you're free to build. The inspector says you can't occupy. The system says independence costs more than most people can afford. And if you want more investigations like this, subscribe. Because this pattern isn't limited to building codes.